The battery commander's hand is still raised, frozen mid-signal, when the first American shells begin falling 300 yards to the west. It is the morning of November 23, 1943, on the volcanic slopes of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, and Captain Takeshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army's 6th Field Artillery Regiment has just made a fatal miscalculation. He has counted. Precisely 4 minutes and 40 seconds have passed since the American guns revealed their position with that first devastating salvo against the Japanese infantry positions dug into the jungle below. 4 minutes and 40 seconds. More than enough time, according to every manual Yamamoto studied at the Imperial Army Artillery School in Chiba, for his own guns to range in and silence the enemy battery before it can displace. His crews have already loaded, aimed, and are awaiting his signal to fire. But the American guns are no longer there. The shells that now tear through the jungle canopy above Yamamoto's position are coming from a completely different location, nearly half a mile north of where the American battery fired from just moments ago. The mathematics don't work. The doctrine doesn't work. Nothing in Yamamoto's training prepared him for artillery that could vanish and reappear like a ghost, that could deliver devastating fire and then simply cease to exist before counter-battery fire could arrive. He lowers his hand slowly, understanding with the cold clarity that comes before death that he has been fighting with the tactics of the last war against an enemy who has invented an entirely new kind of warfare. The American 105mm howitzers are mobile in a way that renders the word almost meaningless. They don't displace, they flow, like water finding new channels, never staying still long enough to die. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This story is not about a single battle or a particular defeat. It is about the collision between two entirely different philosophies of warfare, between the methodical, position-oriented artillery doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army and the revolutionary mobile fire support system developed by the United States Army. It is about Japanese commanders who planned their operations around the assumption that artillery was fundamentally static, an assumption that would cost them not just battles, but entire campaigns. And it is about the 90-second window that changed everything. To understand what happened in the jungles and on the beaches of the Pacific, you have to go back to the soil of France in 1918, where both armies learned lessons that would shape their thinking for the next quarter century. The artillery warfare of the First World War had been characterized by massive guns in fixed positions, by carefully registered fire, missions that took hours to plan and coordinate, by the thunderous but predictable dance of counter-battery duels, where guns on both sides traded shells from positions everyone knew. Japanese artillery officers, many of whom had served as observers with European armies during that war, returned home convinced they understood the fundamental nature of modern artillery combat. The guns were powerful but immobile. Once an enemy battery revealed its position by firing, you had time, precious minutes, sometimes as much as 15 or 20, to bring your own guns to bear and destroy it before it could move. Movement meant vulnerability, meant disconnection from ammunition supplies, meant losing the carefully calculated firing data that had taken hours to develop. The Japanese artillery doctrine that evolved through the 1920s and 30s reflected this understanding. Their guns were excellent. The Type 91 10cm howitzer and the Type 92 70mm battalion gun were reliable, accurate weapons, but the system surrounding them was built for methodical, positional warfare. Japanese batteries established themselves in carefully prepared positions, often reinforced with earthworks and camouflage that took days to construct. They developed detailed range cards, registered their fire on key terrain features, and coordinated with elaborate observation networks. Their doctrine emphasized concentration of fire and prolonged bombardment, the steady application of explosive power against fixed targets. Movement was something you did between battles, not during them. An artillery battery in action was a fortress, static and powerful. The Imperial Japanese Army had other priorities for its limited resources. Japan's industrial capacity, though impressive for an Asian nation, was a fraction of America's. The Japanese allocated their production to areas they believed would prove decisive: aircraft, ships, tanks, small arms. Artillery, prime movers, the trucks and tractors needed to move guns rapidly were far down the priority list. Many Japanese artillery units relied on horses, just as they had in the Russo-Japanese War 4 decades earlier. Even when motorized transport was available, it was often slow, unreliable, repurposed civilian vehicles pressed into military service. The Japanese Artillery Manual of 1941 recommended allowing at least 30 minutes for a battery to fully displace from one firing position to another, and that was considered optimistic. More fundamentally, the Japanese simply didn't prioritize counter-battery fire in the same way the Americans would come to. In their experience fighting in China and Manchuria, where they enjoyed air superiority and their opponents often lacked significant artillery, Japanese guns could fire from relatively exposed positions with little fear of devastating counterfire. The concept of shoot and scoot, the idea that you would fire a mission and immediately displace before counter-battery fire arrived, seemed like an unnecessary complication, a solution to a problem they rarely faced. The American approach to artillery evolved along an entirely different path. The United States Army that emerged from World War I had learned different lessons, particularly from their late entry into that conflict when they operated alongside French forces who had refined their artillery techniques through years of bitter experience. American artillerymen came home convinced that modern warfare demanded flexibility, speed, and above all, survivability. An artillery battery that couldn't move was a dead battery. By the 1930s, as the U.S. Army began its slow modernization, artillery doctrine evolved around a radical premise. The gun was not a fortress, but a weapon system that needed to deliver fire and survive to deliver it again. The development of the 105mm M2A1 howitzer, which would become the standard American light artillery piece of the war, reflected this philosophy. The gun itself was relatively light at just over 2,000 pounds in firing position, heavy enough to deliver a 33-pound high-explosive shell with devastating effect, but light enough to be towed behind a standard 2.5-ton truck at speeds approaching 35 miles per hour on decent roads. But the gun was just part of the system. The Americans designed the entire artillery organization around mobility. Each howitzer had its own prime mover. The ammunition was pre-packaged and truck-loaded. The fire direction center, the brain of the artillery battery, was mounted in a vehicle with radios and maps already set up, ready to operate within minutes of arrival at a new position. The real revolution, though, was in doctrine and communication. American artillery units trained relentlessly on a specific sequence of actions that would become legendary: march order to firing, position, unlimber guns, establish communications, compute firing data, deliver fire mission, prepare for displacement, cease fire, limber guns, and move to new position. The goal was to complete this entire cycle in under 90 seconds from the last round fired. 90 seconds. It seemed impossible. It was anything but. The key was radio communication and the forward observer system. Unlike the Japanese, who often relied on telephone lines that could be cut or visual signals that could be obscured, American artillery units used portable FM radio sets that allowed forward observers attached to infantry units to communicate directly with the fire direction center. When a target was identified, the observer could call for fire and have rounds landing within minutes, sometimes within seconds for pre-registered targets. The fire direction center would compute the firing solution, transmit it to the gun crews, and the howitzers would deliver their shells with brutal efficiency. But here's what made the system revolutionary. The Americans knew that the moment they fired, they had painted a target on their own position. Every Japanese unit within range would be frantically working to determine where those shells came from and return fire. The 90-second displacement drill was designed to ensure that when the counter-battery fire arrived, the Americans were already gone. Training for this level of coordination was intense. American artillery crews in training camps stateside would practice the displacement drill dozens of times per day. Officers timed them with stopwatches, pushing for faster and faster execution. Gun crews learned to work with mechanical precision, each man knowing exactly what his role was, moving without hesitation. The truck drivers learned to back up to the gun trails in darkness, to hook up in seconds rather than minutes. Forward observers learned to estimate ranges and read terrain, to call for fire with the kind of rapid-fire brevity that saved seconds that could mean lives. And the Fire Direction Center officers learned to compute trajectories in their heads, to translate a target location into firing data almost instinctively. By the time American artillery units began deploying to the Pacific in late 1942 and early 1943, they were operating at a level of coordination and speed that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. The standard American artillery battery could arrive at a position, unlimber, receive fire mission data, deliver accurate fire, and be packed up and moving again in 3 to 4 minutes total. The displacement time after the last round fired was consistently under 2 minutes. Often, it was closer to 70 seconds. The Japanese had no idea this was even possible. The first major engagement where this disparity became devastatingly clear was during the Guadalcanal campaign in late 1942 and early 1943. The Americans had landed the 1st Marine Division in August of 1942, seizing the partially completed Japanese airfield and beginning what would become a brutal 6-month struggle for control of the island. Both sides poured in reinforcements. The Japanese sent multiple infantry divisions and substantial artillery support. The Americans brought in the 25th Infantry Division and, critically, the field artillery battalions that would introduce Japanese commanders to a new kind of warfare. The terrain of Guadalcanal seemed to favor the Japanese approach. The island was mountainous, covered in thick jungle, with few roads and challenging logistics. Artillery displacement in such conditions should have been slow, difficult, and dangerous. But the Americans had trained for exactly these conditions. Their gun crews cut firing positions out of the jungle, established concealed access routes, and maintained multiple pre-surveyed positions that they could occupy within minutes. When Japanese infantry attacked American positions, they were met with devastating defensive fires. But when Japanese observers finally located the American gun positions and called in counter-battery fire, the shells would fall on empty jungle. Japanese after-action reports from Guadalcanal, captured later in the war, reveal a growing bewilderment. Battery commanders reported firing on American gun positions, only to find them abandoned when Japanese patrols later overran the area. Some Japanese officers initially believed the Americans were using dummy positions, fake gun emplacements designed to draw fire. But the shells that had rained down from those positions were real enough, and the casualties they inflicted were undeniable. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. The Americans were just faster than the Japanese had thought possible. One specific engagement, documented in both American and Japanese records, illustrates the disparity with brutal clarity. On January 12, 1943, elements of the Japanese 38th Division launched an attack against American positions near the Matanikau River. The assault was preceded by an artillery preparation. Japanese batteries had spent the previous night registering their fire, and at dawn they delivered a coordinated barrage against the American lines. The American infantry, dug into well-prepared positions, weathered the bombardment with relatively light casualties. When the Japanese infantry advanced, they ran into an invisible wall of fire. American forward observers, positioned with the infantry units, had been tracking the Japanese artillery positions through their muzzle flashes during the pre-dawn bombardment. The moment the Japanese guns ceased fire and the infantry attack began, the observers called for counter-battery missions. The American 105th Artillery Battalion, positioned approximately 2 miles behind the front lines, received the fire mission at 06:15 hours. They delivered their first ranging rounds at 06:17. By 06:19, they were firing for effect high explosive shells, landing in a pattern designed to blanket the suspected Japanese gun positions. They fired continuously for 4 minutes, expending over 300 rounds. Then they stopped, limbered their guns, and displaced to a pre-prepared alternate position 800 yards to the north. The Japanese counter-battery response came at 06:28, 13 minutes after the American battery had first fired, and 5 minutes after they had ceased fire and begun moving. Japanese shells fell on the American battery's former position with commendable accuracy. They fired for nearly 10 minutes, expending a substantial portion of their remaining ammunition reserves. But they hit nothing except empty jungle and hastily abandoned shell casings. Meanwhile, from their new position, the American battery was already back in action, supporting the infantry defensive effort and preparing to engage the Japanese guns again if they revealed themselves. The engagement continued throughout the day, with American artillery shifting position multiple times, appearing to fire from impossible locations, delivering devastating barrages, and then simply ceasing to exist before the Japanese could respond effectively. By nightfall, the Japanese attack had been shattered. Their artillery support had been partially silenced, several guns destroyed or damaged by the uncannily accurate American counter-battery fire. The survivors withdrew, and their battery commanders filed reports that would be read with increasing concern at higher headquarters. The enemy artillery demonstrates unprecedented mobility, one captured report stated. They appear to fire from multiple positions simultaneously, though aerial reconnaissance suggests they possess fewer guns than our estimates. Their counter-battery response is nearly instantaneous, and our own guns are silenced before effective fire can be maintained. Recommend revision of current counter-battery doctrine and immediate tactical adjustments. But tactical adjustments were easier to recommend than to implement. The Japanese military machine was not designed for rapid doctrinal evolution, and even if it had been, they lacked the industrial capacity and resources to match American mobility. Japanese artillery units couldn't simply adopt the shoot-and-scoot tactics because they didn't have the prime movers, the radio equipment, or the training to execute them effectively. They were locked into a way of fighting that was becoming obsolete, even as they desperately tried to adapt. The pattern that emerged on Guadalcanal would repeat itself across the Pacific Theatre, at Bougainville, at New Guinea, at Peleliu, at Saipan, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. Everywhere American and Japanese forces clashed, the artillery disparity became increasingly apparent and increasingly decisive. Japanese commanders learned to dread American artillery, not just for its volume or accuracy, but for its seeming omnipresence and invulnerability. You could hear it, you could see its effects, but you couldn't kill it. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the Battle of Saipan in June and July of 1944. By this point in the war, the Japanese were well aware of American artillery capabilities, and they had attempted to develop counter-tactics. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the Japanese forces on Saipan, ordered his artillery units to construct deeply fortified positions in caves and ravines, hoping that increased protection would allow them to survive long enough to deliver effective fire. He also ordered careful camouflage discipline and forbade firing except during major operations, hoping to deny the Americans clear targets for counter-battery work. These tactics bought some time, but couldn't overcome the fundamental mobility advantage. American forces landed on Saipan on June 15, 1944, and within hours, their artillery began coming ashore. The 27th Infantry Division and the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions each brought their organic artillery battalions dozens of guns that could be deployed rapidly across the expanding beachhead. Japanese artillery, positioned in the island's interior, began engaging the American beachhead on the afternoon of the first day. It was a mistake they would pay for dearly. American counter-battery radar, a technology the Japanese didn't possess, detected the Japanese gun flashes within seconds. Forward observers triangulated the positions. Within 3 minutes, American 105mm and 155mm howitzers were delivering concentrated fire on the Japanese artillery positions. The Japanese guns, tucked into their supposedly secure cave positions, found themselves under a deluge of shells that collapsed cave mouths, destroyed camouflage, and killed gun crews. When the Japanese attempted to return fire, they found the American batteries had already displaced. Some Japanese units never got off a single effective counter-battery mission during the entire battle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Americans had refined their system to an art form by this stage of the war. On Saipan, artillery battalions worked in what they called battalion volleys, all 12 guns in a battalion firing simultaneously at a single target, then immediately displacing, while a second battalion took over fire support from a different position. To Japanese observers, it appeared as though American artillery was everywhere at once, firing from dozens of positions. In reality, it was the same guns moving with such speed and coordination that they created the illusion of overwhelming numerical superiority. Lieutenant Toshio Nakamura, a Japanese artillery officer who survived Saipan and was captured later in the war, described the experience in post-war interrogations. His testimony, preserved in American intelligence files, provides a rare window into the Japanese perspective. "We knew where the American guns were," he stated through a translator. "We could see the smoke, hear the reports, calculate the distance and direction. But by the time our fire orders reached the guns, by the time we fired, they were somewhere else. Always somewhere else. We would fire at nothing, at ghosts. It was like fighting the wind." Nakamura's unit, part of the 31st Army Artillery, had been positioned in a valley on the central part of Saipan, with orders to disrupt the American advance. They had excellent positions, good fields of fire, and adequate ammunition. On June 18th, they engaged American forces advancing toward Mount Tapashao. "We fired perhaps 20 rounds," Nakamura recalled. "Good fire. We could see the explosions among the American vehicles. Then their artillery answered. Not immediately, maybe 3 minutes passed. We thought we had time to continue firing, to make adjustments. That is what our doctrine taught us. That is what we had trained for. But the American shells came from 2 directions at once, from positions we had not detected. They fired for perhaps 2 minutes, and in that time, they destroyed 3 of our 6 guns and killed or wounded half my crews." Nakamura's surviving guns attempted to displace to a secondary position they had prepared 600 yards to the east. It took them nearly 40 minutes to limber the guns, move them through the jungle terrain, and prepare to fire again. By that time, American infantry had advanced, and new forward observers had spotted their new position. "We fired once from the new location," Nakamura said, "one ranging shot. The American counterfire began before we could even load the second round. This time it came from 3 different directions. I realized then that we could not win, not because we lacked courage or determination, but because we were fighting with different rules. They could move like cavalry, appear and disappear. We were chained to our positions by our own limitations. The psychological impact of this artillery disparity cannot be overstated. Japanese infantry soldiers, already facing overwhelming odds in terms of air support and naval gunfire, learned to dread American artillery above almost any other weapon. Unlike aircraft or ships, which came and went, artillery was constant. It could reach them anywhere in their bunkers, in their assembly areas, on the attack, in retreat, and it was unkillable. Japanese soldiers developed a fatalistic attitude toward American artillery. When it started falling, You could only take cover and hope. There was no point in trying to silence it, because by the time your own guns responded, the American battery would be gone. This psychological dimension affected Japanese tactical planning at the highest levels. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, tasked with defending Iwo Jima, understood the artillery problem better than most Japanese commanders. He had served as a military attaché in the United States in the late 1920s and had a realistic appreciation of American industrial and military capabilities. When planning Iwo Jima's defenses in late 1944, Kuribayashi explicitly designed his tactics around the assumption that Japanese artillery would be rapidly suppressed once it revealed itself. His solution was radical by Japanese standards. He ordered his artillery to remain completely silent during the initial American landing. Instead of trying to stop the Americans on the beaches with artillery fire, the traditional Japanese doctrine Kuribayashi positioned his guns in deeply buried positions with strict orders not to fire until the Americans had advanced inland, and presented concentrated targets. Even then, his artillery was instructed to fire brief, concentrated missions and then go silent immediately, hoping to deliver damage before the inevitable American counter-battery response arrived. This doctrine reflected a fundamental acceptance of Japanese artillery inferiority. Kuribayashi knew his guns couldn't survive a sustained counter-battery duel with American artillery. His only hope was to preserve them through concealment and brief, surprise engagements. Even this defensive approach had limited success. When the Americans landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, Japanese artillery initially remained silent, just as Kuribayashi ordered. But as American forces advanced inland and began threatening key defensive positions, Japanese battery commanders faced an impossible choice: fire and support the infantry at the cost of revealing their positions, or remain silent and watch the defensive lines collapse. Most chose to fire, and when they did, the American response was devastating and nearly instantaneous. The Americans had learned from 3 years of Pacific combat. Their counter-battery techniques had evolved to include aerial observation, ground-based radar, flash and sound ranging, and networks of forward observers who could triangulate Japanese positions with remarkable accuracy. When a Japanese gun fired on Iwo Jima, it was often under American counterfire within 90 seconds, the same amount of time it took American batteries to displace after firing. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days, from February 19th to March 26, 1945. During that time, American artillery fired over 1 million rounds, an average of nearly 30,000 rounds per day. The 13th Marine Artillery Regiment alone fired 475,000 rounds, roughly 14,000 rounds per gun, over the course of the battle. These staggering numbers were possible only because of the American logistical system's ability to deliver ammunition continuously to mobile batteries that never stayed in one place long enough to be effectively targeted. Japanese artillery, by contrast, was largely silenced within the first week of the battle. Kuribayashi's batteries, carefully positioned and deeply buried, fired their initial missions with some effect but were rapidly identified and subjected to concentrated counter-battery fire. Even guns positioned in caves with limited exposure were destroyed by the sheer volume of American fire. By the end of the first week, only a handful of Japanese artillery pieces remained operational, and these fired only sporadically, hoping to avoid detection. The mathematics of artillery attrition on Iwo Jima tell the story. The Japanese began the battle with approximately 150 artillery pieces of various calibers. American estimates suggest fewer than 20 remained operational by the end of the second week. Those that survived did so by almost never firing. The tactical implications extended beyond simple suppression. American artillery mobility enabled entirely new approaches to combined arms warfare. The rolling barrage technique, where artillery fire moves ahead of advancing infantry at a walking pace, had been attempted in World War I with limited success due to the difficulty of coordinating timing and movement. American artillery units in the Pacific made it routine. Batteries would fire a concentrated barrage at a Japanese position, then shift fire deeper into Japanese territory as infantry advanced, then shift again, creating a moving wall of explosives that Japanese defenders couldn't effectively counter. If Japanese troops moved forward to reoccupy positions after the barrage passed, they ran into American infantry. If they stayed deep in their bunkers, American infantry could close to assault range with relative safety. At Okinawa, the final major battle of the Pacific War, American artillery reached its apex of effectiveness. The 10th Army, which conducted the invasion beginning on April 1, 1945, brought 18 field artillery battalions ashore, 216 guns ranging from 75mm pack howitzers to 155mm long tom guns. These battalions had trained together, developed common operating procedures, and achieved a level of coordination that allowed them to mass fires from multiple battalions on a single target within minutes of a call for fire, then disperse just as rapidly. The Japanese defenders of Okinawa, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, had prepared elaborate fortified positions in the southern part of the island. Ushijima, like Kuribayashi before him, understood that Japanese artillery could not compete directly with American firepower. His defensive plan called for artillery to be used sparingly and only in direct support of major counterattacks. Even with these precautions, Japanese artillery was systematically destroyed. American counter-battery operations on Okinawa achieved what military analysts would later call artillery supremacy, the ability to fire at will while denying the enemy effective use of their own guns. The technical sophistication of American artillery operations by 1945 was remarkable. Forward observers carried radio equipment that weighed less than 30 pounds, but could communicate reliably over distances of 10 miles or more. Fire direction centers used mechanical computers, the M1 director and the M4 plotting board, that could calculate firing data for multiple guns, firing at multiple targets in seconds rather than minutes. Gun crews had refined their displacement procedures to the point where some batteries claimed they could be in march order, 90 seconds after ceasefire was called, though whether this was routine or exceptional performance remained debatable. The Japanese never developed equivalent systems. Their artillery remained fundamentally a World War I weapon system employed in a World War II conflict. This wasn't due to any lack of courage or tactical skill on the part of Japanese artillerymen. It was a consequence of industrial capacity, resource allocation, and doctrinal inertia. Japan simply couldn't produce enough trucks, radios, and prime movers to motorize its artillery effectively. Even if it could have, the training and doctrine required to employ mobile artillery effectively would have taken years to develop and implement. By the time Japanese commanders fully understood what they were facing, it was far too late to adapt. There were Japanese officers who recognized the problem and attempted to address it. After the Guadalcanal campaign, the Imperial General Headquarters issued revised artillery doctrine that emphasized mobility and rapid displacement. Some artillery units in the Philippines and later in the defense of the home islands received additional training in displacement procedures, but these efforts were too little and too late. The fundamental constraints, insufficient vehicles, inadequate radios, limited fuel supplies, and an officer corps trained in static warfare couldn't be overcome through doctrine revisions alone. One of the most telling indicators of the artillery disparity comes from casualty statistics. American sources estimated that Japanese artillery and mortars caused approximately 15 to 20% of American casualties in the Pacific theater, significant, but far less than the 40 to 50% that artillery typically caused in the European theater. By contrast, American artillery was estimated to have caused between 30 and 40% of Japanese casualties, a proportion that increased as the war progressed and American fire control became more sophisticated. On Okinawa, Some estimates placed American artillery's contribution to Japanese casualties as high as 50%, exceeding even the contribution of American small arms fire. These statistics reflect not just volume of fire, but effectiveness of fire. American artillery could be massed rapidly on important targets, could shift fires to respond to changing tactical situations, and could maintain continuous fire support because batteries were never pinned down by counter-battery fire long enough to be destroyed. Japanese artillery, by contrast, was often suppressed before it could deliver effective fire, forced to preserve itself through silence and concealment, and ultimately eliminated piecemeal as batteries revealed themselves and were destroyed before they could displace. The doctrine of the 90-second displacement, the seemingly simple idea that an artillery battery should be able to fire and move before counterfire arrived, had implications that rippled through entire campaigns. It changed the calculus of ground combat, making American infantry advances less costly and Japanese defensive positions more untenable. It contributed to the island-hopping strategy's success by allowing American forces to establish artillery support on newly captured islands rapidly and then project that support across the entire battlefield. It affected Japanese morale, creating a sense of helplessness in the face of an enemy that could strike anywhere and couldn't be struck in return. Some military historians have argued that American artillery mobility was as important to victory in the Pacific as naval superiority or air power. This may be overstated. The Pacific War was won through the combination of many advantages. But there's no question that artillery played a decisive role in ground combat, and that role was magnified enormously by American mobility. Japanese commanders planning operations had to assume they would have limited artillery support, and that whatever support they did have would be quickly neutralized. This forced them into increasingly desperate tactic choices, from suicidal banzai charges designed to close with American forces before artillery could respond, to the kind of static, bunker-focused defense that played to American strengths in firepower. The legacy of this artillery revolution extended far beyond World War II. The lessons learned in the Pacific influenced American artillery doctrine for decades. The emphasis on mobility, rapid displacement, and survivability became fundamental principles. During the Korean War, American artillery units routinely executed fire missions and displacements that would have seemed impossible to their World War I predecessors. The shoot and scoot tactics pioneered in the Pacific became standard procedure. Modern self-propelled artillery systems, which combine the gun and the prime mover into a single vehicle capable of firing and moving within minutes, are the direct descendants of the doctrinal innovations developed to fight the Japanese. The irony is that the Japanese military, in the decades after World War II, embraced many of the principles they had once failed to implement. The Japan Self-Defense Forces, established after the war, studied American artillery doctrine extensively and developed their own highly mobile artillery systems. The lessons that Japanese commanders learned too late in the 1940s became foundational to their successors in the 1950s and beyond. For the men who fought in the Pacific, the artillery disparity was often most visible in small, specific moments. Private First Class Robert Leckie, a Marine veteran who later wrote eloquently about his experiences, described watching American artillery in action on Peleliu in September of 1944. The guns would fire, he wrote, and you'd see the smoke and feel the ground shake. Then, before the smoke even cleared, they'd be moving. Trucks would back up, guns would be hooked up, and they'd be gone like a traveling circus pulling up stakes. And then you'd hear the Japanese shells landing where the guns had been, tearing up empty ground. It was almost comical if it wasn't so deadly serious. That image of Japanese shells falling on empty positions, of artillery that fought like cavalry, appearing and disappearing with choreographed precision, captures something essential about the Pacific War's character. It was a conflict of asymmetries, where the side that could adapt, innovate, and execute complex procedures under combat conditions held decisive advantages. The 90-second displacement drill represented more than just a technical procedure. It represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that privileged speed and flexibility over raw power, that treated the gun as part of a system rather than as an independent weapon. Captain Takeshi Yamamoto, whom we met at the beginning of this story on the slopes of Bougainville, did not survive that morning in November of 1943. His battery position was overrun by American forces later that day, and he died in the fighting, still trying to direct his guns against an enemy that moved faster than his doctrine could accommodate. His story is not unique. Hundreds of Japanese artillery officers died in similar circumstances throughout the Pacific War, victims of a tactical revolution they understood too late or not at all. The American artillerymen who fought in the Pacific rarely received the recognition accorded to infantry, pilots, or naval personnel. Artillery is an unglamorous arm of service, and mobile artillery perhaps even more so. Its victories are measured in missions fired and casualties inflicted, in positions successfully displaced before counterfire arrived, in battles won through the patient application of high explosives. But their contribution was immense. They created a form of warfare that Japanese commanders had no effective answer for, that changed the tactical calculus of every engagement, that made American advances possible and Japanese defenses untenable. The 90-second window, that brief span between firing the last round and clearing the position, represented the difference between survival and destruction, between effective fire support and suppression. It was the product of training, equipment, doctrine, and industrial capacity all working in concert. It was also the product of individual gun crews who executed their procedures with precision under fire, of forward observers who called for fire while bullets cracked past their heads, of fire direction center officers who computed trajectories while shells exploded around their vehicles, of truck drivers who backed up to gun trails in darkness and mud and jungle heat. The story of American artillery mobility in the Pacific is ultimately a story about systems and the people who operated them. The Japanese were not defeated because they lacked courage or tactical skill. They demonstrated both in abundance throughout the war. They were defeated, in part, because they were fighting with a system that couldn't adapt quickly enough to match an enemy that had developed a genuinely revolutionary approach to artillery warfare. The 90-second displacement, that seemingly simple procedure, embodied a complete reimagining of what artillery could be and how it could fight. On the slopes of Bougainville, at the beaches of Saipan, in the caves of Iwo Jima, across the coral ridges of Okinawa, wherever American and Japanese forces met in battle, this disparity played out with brutal consistency. Japanese commanders learned to expect it, to plan around it, to dread it, but they never solved it. The mathematics of mobility, the simple equation that said an artillery battery that could displace in 90 seconds could not be effectively engaged by an enemy that needed 10 minutes to respond, proved insurmountable given the material and doctrinal constraints the Japanese operated under. In the end, the lesson of American artillery mobility in the Pacific was about more than just guns and tactics. It was about the importance of doctrine that matched capabilities, of training that enabled complex procedures to be executed under stress, and of industrial capacity that could provide the tools needed to implement new ways of fighting. It was about the willingness to reimagine established procedures and the flexibility to adapt when conditions changed. These were lessons that extended far beyond artillery, far beyond the Pacific War, into the fundamental nature of modern military effectiveness. The Japanese commanders who faced American artillery in the Pacific learned these lessons at tremendous cost. By the time they fully understood what they were facing, understood the implications of that 90-second window, the war was already lost. Their reports, written in careful Japanese characters and later captured by advancing American forces, tell a story of growing realization and deepening despair. The enemy's artillery was not just more numerous or better supplied, though it was both. It was fundamentally different, operating according to principles that rendered traditional counter-battery tactics obsolete. And so the shells kept falling, always from somewhere else, always delivered by guns that vanished before they could be silenced. The American artillery rolled forward with the infantry, displaced when threatened, fired when needed, and survived to fire again. It was warfare as the Japanese had never conceived it, and they paid the price for that failure of imagination with every position lost, every counterattack shattered, every defensive line broken by the patient, devastating application of mobile fire support. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.